The night Emily Carter disappeared felt ordinary at first, the kind of summer evening people in rural central Kentucky had lived through hundreds of times before. It was August of 1985, and the county fair had returned the way it always did, rolling into town with its temporary rides, livestock trailers, and the familiar promise that for one weekend, nothing bad was supposed to happen. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made cotton shirts stick to backs. The sky was already darkening when families began pouring through the gates, parents holding tickets, children tugging at hands, everyone moving with the easy confidence that came from being surrounded by neighbors. Emily Carter arrived just after sunset with her parents and her 4-year-old brother. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with light brown hair that brushed her shoulders and a quiet way of speaking that made adults lean in when she talked. She wasn't shy exactly, but she wasn't loud either. She stayed close, but not too close, always a few steps ahead, stopping to stare at something that caught her attention, then jogging to catch up. Her mother had already reminded her twice not to wander off. Emily nodded both times, the way children do when they hear the words, but don't feel the danger behind them. The fairgrounds were alive. Music from the ride section bled into the lowing of cattle from the livestock barns. Generators hummed. Gravel crunched under sneakers and boots. Teenagers clustered near the arcade games, while older couples drifted toward the food stands. There was no sense of urgency anywhere, no fear. This was a place where people recognized each other by voice, by posture, by last name. Children ran ahead of their parents, doubling back, disappearing briefly behind trailers or booths, always reappearing a few seconds later. No one panicked when a child slipped from view for a moment. That was just how the fair worked. Emily's family made their way past the rides first, then toward the livestock pavilion, where the smell of hay and animals cut through the grease and sugar of the midway. Emily slowed there, fascinated. She had always loved animals, especially horses, and the pavilion was crowded with kids her age pressing against metal railings, pointing, asking questions. Her father bought tickets for a ring toss game set up just outside the barn, while her mother kept an eye on both children, one hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes flicking back to Emily every few seconds. Emily lingered near a prize booth beside the pavilion, studying the rows of stuffed animals hanging from hooks. She asked if she could try to win one. Her mother told her to wait until her father came back. Emily nodded, stepping closer to the booth, her attention fully locked on the prizes swaying gently in the warm air. It was the kind of moment that barely registered, one of thousands of small, forgettable details that make up a normal night. When her father returned a few minutes later, Emily wasn't where she had been standing. Her mother turned, scanning the immediate area, expecting to see her just a few steps away. She wasn't alarmed. Children moved constantly at the fair. Emily had probably walked around the side of the booth or drifted closer to the animals. Her mother called her name once, casually, her voice swallowed by the noise around them. There was no answer. They waited a moment, then another. Her father walked a short distance toward the pavilion entrance, peering inside. Her mother checked behind the booth, then near the railings. Emily wasn't there. Still, it felt manageable. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The sense of ease began to thin, just slightly, like a thread pulling tight. Her mother raised her voice, calling Emily's name again, louder this time. A few people glanced over, but no one seemed concerned. Someone suggested she might be in the restroom. Her father walked their son over to a nearby bench and told him to stay put, then headed toward the bathrooms. Emily wasn't there either. 15 minutes had passed. The fair no longer felt friendly. The sounds that had been comforting a short time earlier began to blur into something overwhelming. Her mother stood near the prize booth, scanning faces, watching children pass, each one not Emily. She approached a fair volunteer and explained that her daughter was missing just for a moment, probably. The volunteer nodded, calm, telling her they would keep an eye out. 30 minutes passed. That was when the panic arrived, sudden and sharp. Her mother's voice changed when she said Emily's name now. Her father returned, shaking his head. They split up, walking in opposite directions, checking the same places again, then new ones. The livestock barn was searched aisle by aisle. Emily's name echoed uselessly off the metal walls. People began to notice the urgency. Other parents pulled their children closer. A few joined the search instinctively, scanning the ground, peering under bleachers and behind trailers. An hour passed, and by then, no one was pretending this was normal anymore. Fair staff were notified officially. The gates were closed, not locked, but monitored. Announcements crackled over the loudspeakers, asking anyone who had seen a 7-year-old girl named Emily Carter to report to the main office. Her description was repeated again and again, each time sounding smaller, more fragile. People stopped what they were doing. Lines at the food stands thinned. Rides slowed. Flashlights appeared, beams cutting across the dark corners of the grounds. Emily's parents stood near the center of it all, their world narrowing to a single point. Her mother replayed the last image of her daughter over and over. The way Emily's head had tilted as she looked at the prizes, the way her hair had fallen forward. Her father felt the weight of every minute he hadn't been watching closely enough. Guilt crept in early, heavy and immediate, even before fear fully took hold. By the time Kentucky State Police were called, it was nearing midnight. Patrol cars rolled onto the fairgrounds, lights flashing but sirens off, as if volume alone could make things worse. Troopers spoke with fair staff, with Emily's parents, with anyone who thought they might have seen something. Notes were taken. Times were written down, crossed out, rewritten. The search expanded outward, into the surrounding parking areas, into the tree lines beyond the lights. Dogs were requested but hadn't arrived yet. Volunteers formed loose lines, moving through grass and gravel, calling her name into the dark. No one found a shoe. No one found a ribbon. No one reported hearing a scream or seeing a child being led away. There was no argument, no struggle, no moment anyone could point to and say, "That's when it happened." As the hours stretched on, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. The fairgrounds, so full earlier, now felt hollow and exposed. Rides sat silent. Booth lights flickered off one by one. The place where Emily had been last seen looked impossibly small, as if a child could not simply vanish from such an open space without someone noticing. But she had. Sometime after 2 a.m., the active search paused, only briefly, to reorganize. Officers spoke quietly among themselves. Emily's parents were asked to sit, to drink water, to answer the same questions again. When had they arrived? What had she been wearing? Did she know anyone at the fair? Had she ever wandered off before? Each question landed like an accusation, even when it wasn't meant to be one. The fairgrounds were still flooded with light, with people, with motion, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. No trail, no witness, no explanation. Just a 7-year-old girl who had been standing beside a prize booth less than 3 hours earlier and now existed only in memory. As dawn approached, the temperature began to drop slightly, and the realization settled in, quiet and terrifying. Whatever had happened to Emily Carter hadn't been loud. It hadn't been obvious. It had slipped in between moments, unnoticed, and by the time anyone understood what they were looking for, she was already gone. Morning arrived without relief. The sun came up over the fairgrounds the same way it always did, pale and slow, revealing what the darkness had hidden and confirming what everyone already feared. Emily Carter was still gone. The overnight search had turned up nothing that could be held, measured, or explained. No discarded clothing, no disturbed ground, No trace that a 7-year-old child had passed through the chaos of the fair and out the other side. By daylight, the situation shifted from panic to procedure. What had begun as a desperate, frantic search became a formal missing child investigation, governed by the tools and limitations of the mid-1980s. Kentucky State Police took control, joined by local deputies and volunteers who refused to go home. A temporary command post was set up near the fair office, its tables cluttered with coffee cups, legal pads, and stacks of handwritten notes. Emily's name was written again and again, sometimes spelled wrong, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled, as if emphasis alone could bring her back. Search teams fanned out in organized groups. The fairgrounds were walked inch by inch in daylight. The gravel paths, the spaces between trailers, the backs of booths where shadows had pooled the night before. Officers crawled under bleachers and peered into dumpsters that had already been checked in the dark. Beyond the gates, volunteers moved into the nearby woods, pushing through brush and tall grass, calling Emily's name until their voices went hoarse. Drainage ditches were inspected, parking lots were mapped, each row accounted for, every abandoned cup or scrap of paper examined and dismissed. Tracking dogs were brought in late that morning. Handlers walked them to the area near the livestock pavilion where Emily had last been seen. The dogs worked methodically, noses low, tails stiff, until they didn't. Near the edge of the pavilion, the scent faded, then disappeared entirely. There was no clear path leading away, no direction the dogs could follow beyond a few confused circles. To investigators, this absence spoke louder than any discovery. Children who wander usually leave a trail. Emily hadn't. The lack of physical evidence began to shape the conversation. Officers compared notes, timelines, witness statements scribbled in uneven handwriting. No one had seen Emily crying. No one had reported a struggle. No one remembered a child being led by the hand toward the exits. Even the people stationed near the gates had nothing useful to offer. Hundreds of people had left the fair that night, cars pulling out in steady streams, headlights washing over the gravel. Somewhere in all that movement, Emily had vanished without making a sound. Early theories were explored quickly, then revisited again and again. The simplest explanation, that Emily had wandered off on her own, lost its weight as the hours passed. A 7-year-old unfamiliar with the surrounding area would have been noticed by someone. The woods were searched, the roads were driven repeatedly. There were no reports of a child found wandering, injured or otherwise, in the surrounding towns. Abduction moved to the front of investigators' minds, though it was spoken carefully, as if naming it might make it real. Stranger abductions were rare, especially in places like this, but not unheard of. Officers began checking vehicles that had been parked near the livestock area. License plates were written down. Owners were tracked down and interviewed. Most had alibis that checked out. Some were offended at the implication. None of it led anywhere. Then there was the question no parent ever once asked. Emily's mother and father were interviewed separately, then together, then separately again. The questions were methodical, impersonal. Where were you standing? When did you last see her? Had you argued? Had Emily ever talked about running away? Had there been any recent stress in the home? Each interview was recorded in notes and memory, the same answers compared for inconsistencies that never appeared. The scrutiny took a visible toll. Emily's mother slept little, her face hollowing with each passing hour. Her father oscillated between anger and numbness, replaying the same moments in his head, convinced he could find the exact second everything went wrong. Friends and family hovered nearby, trying to be useful, failing. By the end of the second day, investigators quietly ruled them out, not because they wanted to, but because there was simply nothing tying them to what had happened. Attention shifted outward again. Several individuals drew interest, though none stood out enough to hold. A carnival worker with a prior record for petty theft was interviewed extensively. He admitted to drinking that night, to wandering the grounds after his shift ended, but multiple people placed him elsewhere at the time Emily disappeared. A local man, known to linger near children's attractions, was questioned after witnesses recalled seeing him near the prize booths. His presence was uncomfortable but not illegal, and his movements didn't align with the narrow window when Emily vanished. A fair volunteer who lived nearby was also interviewed. He had helped with setup and teardown, had access to areas others didn't, and was familiar with the grounds. His answers were calm, precise. He denied seeing Emily and had no obvious reason to lie. Without evidence, suspicion couldn't harden into action. Door-to-door canvassing began in the surrounding neighborhoods. Officers knocked on doors with clipboards in hand, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Some people remembered headlights at odd hours, others remembered nothing at all. Every detail was written down, even the ones that led nowhere. Tips poured in, overwhelming in their volume and thin in their usefulness. A woman thought she'd seen a little girl near a gas station miles away. A man reported a suspicious van, then couldn't describe it. The days blurred together. News crews arrived, then moved on. Emily's photograph was printed and reprinted, taped to windows, handed out at intersections. Her parents stood before microphones they didn't want, repeating the same plea, their voices cracking in ways that couldn't be edited out. For a moment, it felt like the entire state was watching, waiting. But attention is a fragile thing. By the third day, the energy shifted again. Search areas were expanded, but the intensity softened. Volunteers dwindled. Officers were reassigned back to regular duties. The official language changed. What had been an active search became an ongoing investigation. The fairgrounds, once the center of everything, were returned to their empty state. Rides dismantled, trailers gone, the ground scarred with tire tracks and footprints that meant nothing now. There was no announcement, no formal moment marking the change. Emily's parents felt it anyway. They felt it in the way conversations shortened, in the way officers avoided making promises they could no longer keep. When the search was officially scaled back, it landed like a quiet verdict. Emily Carter was no longer a crisis. She was a case. Within weeks, headlines shifted. Other stories replaced hers. Tips slowed, then stopped. Emily's face lingered on a few bulletin boards, then faded there too, curling at the edges. In the files of the Kentucky State Police, her name remained typed and filed, waiting. And somewhere between the unanswered questions and the empty spaces on those forms, Emily became something else entirely. Not a child who had just gone missing, but Kentucky's quiet missing girl, carried forward by her parents' refusal to stop looking, even as the world around them learned how to move on without her. Time did what it always does. It moved forward, quietly and without permission, carrying everyone with it except Emily Carter. As the late 1980s settled in, her face began to fade from the places where it had once been unavoidable. Flyers peeled from telephone poles. Newspaper clippings yellowed inside folders and drawers. New children were born in the town, learned to walk, learned to ride bikes, grew taller than Emily ever would. But in her parents' home, time stalled in a single room. Emily's bedroom stayed exactly as it had been the night she disappeared. Her bed was made every morning. Her clothes remained folded in the dresser, sorted by season. Toys sat where she had left them, some gathering dust, others carefully cleaned as if she might come back and want them again. Her mother still entered the room daily, sometimes to tidy, sometimes just to sit. The door was never fully closed. Closing it felt like an admission neither parent was ready to make. Outside the house, life continued with a cruelty that felt personal. Emily's parents aged under a kind of constant observation. At the grocery store, at church, at school events for their younger son, they felt eyes on them, measuring their grief, looking for cracks. The early suspicion had faded officially, but its residue remained. In small towns, people don't forget questions easily. They simply stop asking them out loud. Every August, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, her parents organized a vigil. The first year, dozens of people came. Candles lined the edge of the old fairgrounds. Names were spoken. Promises were made. The second year, fewer attended. By the fifth, the crowd had thinned to a handful of familiar faces, mostly family, mostly obligation. By the early 1990s, the vigil was little more than a quiet gathering near the gate where Emily had last been seen, the candles replaced by flowers, the speeches replaced by silence. Investigators never formally closed the case, but it drifted in and out of attention as personnel changed and priorities shifted. Every few years, a new detective would pull the file, read through the reports, and try to see what others had missed. The same facts remained, the same absence. Without physical evidence, the case existed only as paper and memory. Tips continued to come in, though less frequently as time passed. A truck driver claimed he had seen a girl matching Emily's description at a rest stop in Tennessee, years after her disappearance. Investigators followed it as far as they could, interviewing employees, checking receipts, chasing down a face that never materialized. Another tip came in the form of a letter, mailed without a return address, suggesting the writer knew what had happened to Emily. The handwriting was shaky, the details vague. It was impossible to verify. The letter was filed away, another piece of something that didn't fit. Technology advanced, but Emily's case didn't benefit from it. DNA databases grew, forensic techniques improved, but there was nothing to submit, nothing to compare. No blood, no clothing, no remains. Each new development in criminal investigation felt like a door opening just far enough to reveal another locked door behind it. Inside the Carter home, the psychological toll deepened. Emily's mother lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn fully, unable to hope honestly. She woke each morning with the same question she had carried for years. Is today the day? Her father threw himself into work, then into advocacy, attending meetings, speaking with other families of missing children, clinging to the idea that staying active meant staying connected to Emily in some way. Their younger son grew up in the shadow of a sister he barely remembered. He learned early not to ask certain questions, not because they were forbidden, but because they hurt. He watched his parents measure time not in years, but in how long Emily had been gone. He learned what absence could do to a family, how it could become a permanent presence. The town changed, too. New businesses opened, old ones closed. People who had searched side by side in 1985 moved away or passed on. For those who remained, Emily's disappearance hardened into something like folklore. Some spoke of it in hushed tones, as a warning. Others spoke of it with certainty they didn't earn. One version said she had wandered into the woods and died unseen. Another said she had been taken by someone passing through, gone before anyone realized what was happening. A quieter rumor suggested she had never left the fairgrounds alive. There were those who believed Emily had been trafficked, that she was somewhere far away, unaware of her real name, her real family. That idea lingered in the background, fueled by the absence of evidence and the human need for a living answer. Her mother sometimes allowed herself to imagine Emily as a teenager, then an adult, living a life that didn't include them. The thought was painful, but it was also a form of hope. As the 1990s turned into the early 2000s, Emily's photograph was updated using age progression techniques. The images were unsettling, a stranger built on familiar bones. They were circulated briefly, then quietly retired when no leads followed. Each new image felt like another small loss, another acknowledgement of time's passing. Investigators continued to check the file occasionally, usually prompted by a tip or a milestone anniversary. Each review ended the same way, with more questions than answers. The case remained officially open, but inactive, its movement dependent on information that never came. Emily's father held on longer than anyone expected. He attended every vigil, even when it was just him and his wife standing together in the dark. He spoke to reporters when they called, even years later, repeating the same plea, his voice older but steady. He refused to let Emily's name disappear completely, even as it slipped further from public consciousness. In 2015, after nearly 3 decades of waiting, he died quietly, his health worn down by years of stress and unanswered questions. His death marked something no one wanted to name. With him gone, the last living witness to Emily's childhood was fading. The man who had last held her hand at the fair, who had spent 30 years searching for her, never learned what happened to his daughter. Shortly after his death, the case was officially labeled what it had been in practice for years: inactive, unresolved. The words were clinical, final in their own way. They didn't mean the investigation was closed, only that it had nowhere left to go. Emily remained 7 years old in every record that mattered, frozen in the moment before she vanished, preserved in photographs and memory while the world around her kept moving. Her mother continued to live in the same house, the bedroom still waiting, the door still open. And somewhere beyond the old fairgrounds, beyond the rumors and the files and the decades of silence, there were places no one had thought to look closely enough, spaces that had existed all along, unnoticed, holding their secrets as time passed. For 30 years, the answers stayed buried beneath routine and familiarity, hidden not by distance or complexity, but by the simple assumption that there was nothing left to find. The case of Emily Carter had gone quiet long before it went cold, filed away as one of those tragedies that resisted resolution. Then, in the spring of 2015, something unrelated happened, the kind of ordinary event that rarely intersects with unfinished grief. An old farmhouse changed hands. The property sat less than 2 miles from where the county fairgrounds once stood, close enough that the sound of music and generators would have carried on warm nights back in the 1980s. It was a modest place, weathered and slightly sagging, surrounded by overgrown grass and a line of trees that shielded it from the road. For decades, it had belonged to a man named Harold Whitman. He had died quietly the previous winter, in his late 70s, leaving no immediate family behind, and little reason for anyone to linger over his past. To most people in town, Whitman had been unremarkable in the safest way. He worked maintenance jobs, fixed what needed fixing, volunteered when asked. In 1985, he had been one of dozens of locals who helped the county fair with setup and teardown, a familiar face in a place full of them. When the house went up for sale, no one connected it to anything else. The new owners planned renovations. The farmhouse needed work, and they intended to modernize it while preserving its structure. It was during those early stages, while clearing out decades of neglect from the basement, that something felt wrong. The floor, uneven in places, didn't sound the same everywhere. In one corner, the concrete gave a dull, hollow thud when struck, different from the solid resistance elsewhere. At first, it seemed like poor construction, a patch job done cheaply years ago. But as contractors removed layers of old flooring and debris, they found a seam. Beneath it was concrete that didn't match the rest, poured more recently than the surrounding foundation, smoothed carefully, deliberately. It wasn't cracked or crumbling. It was intact, sealed, intentional. As they worked, more details emerged. A narrow pipe ran along the basement wall, disappearing into the concrete. It wasn't part of the house's plumbing or electrical system. It had been installed by hand, its placement awkward, its purpose unclear. Ventilation, maybe. That was the first word someone said out loud, though no one wanted to finish the thought. When the concrete was finally breached, The space beneath was revealed slowly, reluctantly, as if it had resisted being seen for decades. It wasn't large, barely tall enough for an adult to stand upright. The walls were unfinished, rough, and the air inside was stale in a way that suggested it hadn't been disturbed in years. This wasn't a crawl space, it wasn't storage, it was a room. Inside there was nothing dramatic at first glance. No furniture, no writing on the walls, just a small enclosed space that felt wrong the longer it was observed. Then someone noticed a piece of fabric caught in a corner, pressed against the concrete. It was old, faded, but recognizable. Child-sized clothing, the style consistent with the mid-1980s. Work stopped immediately. Police were called, and within hours, the basement was sealed as a potential crime scene. Investigators moved carefully, documenting everything before touching it. More items were recovered as the space was examined thoroughly. A hair ribbon, its color dulled by time. A plastic bracelet, brittle and worn, stamped with the name of a county fair that no longer existed in that form. The bracelet mattered. Fairground bracelets were changed every year. Their colors, materials, even the printing style varied. This one matched records from 1985. When the connection was made, it sent a ripple through a case that had been dormant for years. Emily Carter's name resurfaced in a way it hadn't since her father's death. Detectives who had worked the original investigation, now retired, were contacted. Files were pulled back out. Timelines were redrawn. Attention turned, inevitably, to the man who had lived above that basement. Harold Whitman had never been a suspect. In 1985, he had been interviewed briefly, like many volunteers, but nothing about him had stood out. He lived nearby. He had access. He had no criminal record that would have raised alarms at the time. He was described by neighbors as quiet, reliable, the kind of person you trusted without thinking about why. Now, every detail of his life was re-examined under a different light. His volunteer role at the fair, his proximity to the livestock pavilion, his work schedule, his routines. Investigators learned that Whitman had lived alone for most of his adult life. He kept to himself. No one could recall visitors staying overnight. No one could say with certainty what his evenings looked like 30 years earlier. The timing aligned in ways that felt unsettling. The concrete beneath the basement floor was tested. Its composition and aging suggested it had been poured sometime in the mid-1980s. The ventilation pipe, likewise, showed signs of age consistent with that period. Whatever had been built down there hadn't been added later. It had been there, unseen, since around the time Emily vanished. Forensic teams worked meticulously, aware of the stakes. Fibers were collected. The items found were preserved and compared against what little documentation existed from Emily's case. Clothing descriptions matched. The hair ribbon resembled one Emily had worn often, according to her mother. The bracelet was the kind handed out to children entering the fairgrounds, meant to be cut off at the end of the night. Investigators were careful not to draw conclusions publicly, but privately, the shift was undeniable. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a random discovery. This was a place that had been designed to hide something or someone, and to do so in a way that avoided attention for decades. As word spread quietly through law enforcement circles, a different kind of shock settled in. The idea that the answer might have been so close for so long was difficult to process. The farmhouse had been searched once, briefly in the early days of the investigation, but only superficially. There had been no cause to dig into the basement floor. No warrant. No reason. Now, with Whitman gone, questions multiplied without the possibility of answers from the one person who might have had them. Investigators reconstructed what they could from records, from interviews with aging neighbors, from the physical evidence itself. Each new piece tightened the focus, narrowing the possibilities. The basement wasn't an accident. It wasn't a structural flaw. It wasn't an oversight. Everything about it suggested planning, effort, secrecy. By the time the initial forensic analysis was complete, detectives understood the gravity of what they were standing over. This space hadn't been built to store things. It hadn't been built to fix a problem with the foundation. It had been built to contain. And in that realization, the disappearance of Emily Carter stopped being a mystery of chance and became something far more deliberate, forcing investigators to confront what might have happened to a 7-year-old girl after she vanished into the noise of a county fair, and what that hidden room had truly been used for all those years ago. The work that followed was quiet, methodical, and heavy in a way no one in the room needed explained. Once the basement was sealed as a crime scene, the process moved slowly, constrained by time, decay, and the responsibility of getting it right. Forensic teams treated the space with the same care they would have given a much larger scene, knowing that whatever story existed here would be told through fragments. Fibers were collected first, lifted carefully from the concrete floor and the rough walls. Many were too degraded to be useful, but a small number were preserved well enough for comparison. Investigators returned to the original case file, pulling clothing descriptions that had been written down in 1985. The match was not dramatic. It was quiet. The weave, the color remnants, the fiber type aligned with what Emily Carter had been wearing the night she disappeared. It wasn't proof on its own. It was context. And context was something this case had been missing for decades. The items found in the space were cataloged next. The hair ribbon, the bracelet, the scraps of fabric. Each was examined, photographed, and preserved. The bracelet, in particular, drew attention again. Its material and printing style placed it firmly in the mid-1980s. Fair records confirmed it matched the batch distributed the year Emily vanished. The kind of object meant to be temporary, meant to be discarded, meant to exist only for a single night. As the basement was cleared, attention shifted upward into the house itself. Investigators moved room by room, careful not to impose meaning where there was none. In the attic, among boxes of old tools and holiday decorations, they found something that changed the shape of the investigation entirely. Photographs. They were tucked inside a plain envelope, yellowed and brittle at the edges. The images were small, the kind developed at local drugstores decades ago. There were no dates written on the back, no names. But the child in the photographs was unmistakable. Her hair was lighter in some, darker in others, her face longer as the years passed. But the eyes were the same as the girl who had stared out from missing posters in 1985. Investigators didn't rush to say the name. They compared, they measured, they brought in specialists. The photographs appeared to show the same child at different ages, progressing from early childhood into adolescence. There were no other children in the images. No adults. The settings were nondescript, interiors mostly, offering little clue as to where or when they were taken. But the implication was unavoidable. Emily Carter had survived the night she disappeared. That realization landed differently for everyone involved. For some, it brought a sharp, painful kind of relief. For others, it introduced a new weight entirely. Surviving didn't mean safe. It didn't mean rescued. It meant time had passed somewhere no one could see. Investigators began reconstructing what they believed had happened, guided strictly by evidence and verified timelines. Harold Whitman's volunteer role at the fair put him in proximity to the livestock pavilion where Emily was last seen. Witness statements from 1985 placed him in that area throughout the evening. As a volunteer, he had authority without scrutiny. He was someone a child might trust, especially one who was already separated from her parents. The prevailing theory did not rely on force or chaos. It didn't need to. It suggested something quieter, a simple offer of help, a reassurance, an adult saying the right words at the right moment. No screams, no struggle. Just a child following someone she believed was there to help her. From there, The evidence pointed inward, toward the farmhouse. The basement space had been constructed deliberately, hidden beneath a false floor, ventilated just enough to sustain life. It was not a place someone stumbled into. It was a place someone planned. Biological traces recovered from the basement reinforced what the photographs suggested. Skin cells, hair fragments, degraded but present, matched Emily's family through advanced testing that hadn't existed when she vanished. Dental records, sparse as they were, aligned with impressions found on personal items recovered from the house. There was no indication that Emily had been moved between multiple locations. Everything pointed to that house. Investigators were careful in how they described what followed. There were no claims that couldn't be supported. No attempts to fill in emotional gaps with speculation. The evidence suggested long-term isolation, extended presence, a life confined to a space designed to be unseen. There was no indication that Emily attended school, no records, no sightings that could be confirmed. The photographs showed growth, but also stagnation, the kind that comes from limited exposure to the outside world. The house had been her world, reduced to a handful of rooms and a hidden space beneath them. No evidence suggested she ever left alive. That conclusion was reached slowly, reluctantly, after every alternative was exhausted. There were no later photographs, no signs of her presence in the years immediately before Whitman's death, no financial records, no medical visits, no communication with the outside world that could be linked to her. The trail ended somewhere in the past, its exact point impossible to determine. The question of what happened to her remains lingered, unanswered, and painful. The basement held no remains. The surrounding property was searched extensively, ground-penetrating radar used to scan for disturbances. Nothing was found. Investigators considered the possibility that Whitman had disposed of her body elsewhere, at a location not yet identified, or one that had changed beyond recognition over time. For Emily's mother, the revelation brought a complicated kind of truth. Her daughter had not vanished into nothing. She had lived. She had been somewhere. But the years between were filled with suffering no parent could fully comprehend. There was no reunion waiting at the end of this story. No survivor to hear. Only answers that arrived decades too late. Law enforcement prepared their findings carefully, aware of the responsibility they carried. Harold Whitman was named posthumously as the prime suspect. The language was precise. The conclusions supported by evidence. There would be no trial, no confession, no opportunity for confrontation. What remained was the truth. Incomplete, but undeniable. Emily Carter had been taken from a place of noise and light and kept hidden in silence. She had grown up out of sight. She had died without ever being found. And as investigators closed in on what they could prove, another question pressed forward, one that could not be answered by forensics alone. How a man so unremarkable, so trusted, had carried a secret like this for years, and how many times the house had been passed without anyone thinking to look beneath its floor. When authorities finally stood in front of microphones to explain what had been found, there was no sense of triumph in their voices. No relief, just a careful, deliberate recitation of facts that had taken 30 years to surface. The case of Emily Carter, missing since August of 1985, was being reclassified, not reopened, not revived, resolved. The word landed heavily because everyone understood what it didn't mean. There would be no arrest. No courtroom. No verdict handed down in a language that promised balance or justice. The findings were laid out plainly. The hidden space beneath the farmhouse, the personal items, the forensic links, the photographs. Harold Whitman, deceased, named as the sole suspect based on evidence that could no longer be challenged or expanded. The investigation had reached its limits. There was nothing more to extract from the past. Emily's mother was notified privately before the announcement was made public. She had lived long enough with uncertainty that certainty Even this kind felt unreal at first. For decades, every phone call had carried a quiet possibility. Every knock on the door had held a breath she didn't know she was still holding. Now the call came, not with hope, but with explanation. Her daughter had not been lost to chance. She had not vanished without reason. She had been taken, hidden, and kept from the world until her life ended somewhere no one could see. There was no right way to receive that information, no words that could soften it. Emily's mother listened, asked questions she already knew the answers to, and then sat in the same house she had lived in since 1985, surrounded by the weight of time that had never fully moved on. The bedroom door was still open. The space beyond it finally had context, but no peace. When the news broke publicly, the town reacted in waves. Disbelief came first. The idea that the answer had been so close, embedded in the landscape, was difficult to reconcile. People remembered Harold Whitman as he had always been presented: quiet, reliable, the man who fixed things when they broke. The volunteer who showed up early and stayed late. There were no stories of cruelty attached to his name, no moments anyone could point to and say they should have known. Then guilt followed. It moved through the community slowly, unevenly, attaching itself to small memories. A wave from across the road, a conversation at the hardware store, the times the farmhouse had been passed without a second glance. Familiarity, it turned out, had been a kind of camouflage. The town had trusted what it recognized, and in doing so had never looked closely enough. Investigators spoke openly about that reality. They didn't assign blame to the community, but they didn't shield it either. Crimes like this didn't always announce themselves. Sometimes they existed quietly, sustained by routine and the assumption that danger came from somewhere else. The fact that Whitman had been a volunteer, a helper, someone integrated into the fabric of the fair, mattered. It explained how access could be mistaken for safety, how proximity could replace scrutiny. Memorials were organized, not out of obligation, but out of a need to speak Emily's name without hesitation. At the edge of the old fairgrounds, where the rides no longer came and the land sat unused, people gathered again. Some had been there before, years earlier, holding candles and waiting for answers. This time there were no questions left, only acknowledgement. Emily's name was spoken clearly, not as a missing person, not as a possibility, as a child who had lived, suffered, and died unseen. For the first time, there was no uncertainty attached to her story, no conditional language. She was not believed to be gone. She was gone. Law enforcement closed the case formally soon after. The file was updated, its status changed in ways that mattered mostly on paper. The investigation was considered solved, the suspect identified, the circumstances established as fully as the evidence allowed. It was the best outcome available in a situation that offered no good ones. For Emily's family, resolution didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in the knowledge that she had not been forgotten, in the understanding that their years of searching had not been meaningless, in the painful clarity that justice, in the traditional sense, was no longer possible. Harold Whitman had died without answering for what he had done. There would be no apology, no explanation, no accountability beyond the truth itself. The town settled into a new version of its history. The story of the fair changed. The farmhouse was no longer just an old building on a quiet road. It became a point of reference, a reminder of how easily evil could blend into the ordinary. People spoke differently about the past, more cautiously, more aware of what they hadn't seen. Emily Carter was no longer Kentucky's quiet missing child. She was no longer frozen at 7 years old in a photograph taped to a window. She was understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to end the silence that had surrounded her for 3 decades. The hidden basement didn't return what had been taken. It didn't offer comfort. But it did something else, something that mattered. It told the truth. And in doing so, it closed one chapter of waiting, even as it left behind the harder work of living with what that truth meant.